Hello, and welcome to the Relationship Anxiety Podcast. For those of you who have never joined us before, extra hello. My name is Chrisenia, and I am a certified relationship anxiety coach. So basically, that means I specialize in helping people who struggle with relationship anxiety and relationship OCD to get out of fear and move into love. So, our topic today is anxiety versus intuition, which is a whole thing. This topic comes up with almost every single person that I meet with, everyone that I help, and it was a really huge part of my story. And today I'm going to use the idea of revelation from God and intuition interchangeably. So if you are religious and you really struggle figuring out if something is the spirit versus anxiety, the same principles are going to apply. I'm just going to use the word intuition today. And like I said, this comes up in, I want to say, every single person that I have ever helped. So if you struggle with this, you are not alone and you're in the right place. And before we really dive into discerning the difference between anxiety and intuition, I first want to focus on why we want the answer so badly. So I hear a lot like, I just don't know if this is God or if this is my intuition or if this is anxiety. And we have this idea that if we can figure out if it is anxiety, then we know that we don't have to listen to that voice. Versus if it's intuition, I better listen. And a lot of the time it's because we are trying to either maximize like happiness in the future or minimize pain in the future. That's why we're trying to answer this question of, is it anxiety or is it intuition? Because if it's actually intuition and I don't listen and I make the wrong choice, then I'm going to feel all of these negative emotions. I'm going to feel regret in the future. I'm going to feel heartbreak. I'm going to feel shame. Or I'm just going to feel bored. And first, we want to recognize that this question is actually being fueled by fear, right? We're afraid of feeling all of these things in the future. And so we don't really want to answer this question when we're in a space of fear. And so I have found that even more important than figuring out if something is anxiety or intuition is learning to recognize the language of anxiety. Because anxiety is so tricky and it shows up in so many different ways, right? It even shows up in this question, is this anxiety or is this my intuition? And once we can learn the language of anxiety, we're better able to pick it out and to recognize it. So if you've ever learned a language before, you know that different languages, obviously they use different words, but they also might use different sentence structure. They might use different grammar. It's going to sound different. And you can say different things in another language, and it might all sound like Spanish, right? Even though you're saying two different things. And we're able to recognize it as Spanish, like I said, because some of the words that are used, some of the sentence structure, some of the grammar. And you might hear someone say a sentence in Spanish and then say a different sentence in Spanish, and you're still able to recognize that they're still speaking Spanish, even though they said something different. And this is what we want to learn with anxiety. We want to learn the language so that even when it switches what it's saying, maybe it switches the specific fear, we're still able to recognize it as anxiety and as the language of anxiety. I also like to think about it as like different flavors of ice cream, right? Vanilla and chocolate are very different, but they're both flavors of ice cream. And so you might notice different flavors of anxiety showing up in your life. And we want to learn to recognize the characteristics of ice cream, right? The characteristics of anxiety so that you can start to notice what is anxiety. And a disclaimer before we start, before I teach you some of the things that I have learned are characteristics of the language of anxiety, I first want to give a disclaimer that we can become obsessive about figuring out if this is anxiety, right? Just like we talked about at the beginning with how the question, is this anxiety or is this intuition, can be fueled by anxiety. We can become obsessive about figuring it out. And so I just want you to be aware of that, to be aware that obsessing over figuring out if something is anxiety is still anxiety. So, without further ado, here are a couple of the characteristics of the language of anxiety that I have learned. The first one is that anxiety is often centered in the future or in the past. It's most often the future, though. Right? It says, oh, but what if in the future, blah, 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 blah. Intuition, on the other hand, is often centered in the present. It says, oh, I think right now maybe I want to do this. Another characteristic of anxiety is the energy behind anxiety, right? Anxiety is often very frantic, very urgent, and it wants you to act right now. Whereas intuition is often calm and patient, and it knows that everything is going to work out. Another characteristic of anxiety is that there are often a bunch of what ifs attached to it and a big, long, scary story. So I remember when I was younger and I was still living at my parents' house with all of my siblings, I would have this feeling like, oh my gosh, I need to go check on my brother, make sure he's still breathing. I need to just go check on my little sister. I need to just go check on them real quick and make sure that they're okay. Right? Because I would go to bed after they all went to bed. And there was this big scary story in my head of what if they're not breathing and they're dying? Or what if you are the person that could save their life right now and you don't, and they're going to die and you're going to feel awful about it because you didn't check? And a lot of the time in our relationships, we have similar scary what if stories, right? Our brain goes to the absolute worst case scenario and it says, what if you get divorced later and your kids grow up and they have a terrible life? You better just break up now, right? And so there are all of these scary what if stories. Or what if God doesn't love me? What if God doesn't accept me if I choose this person? That's a really big, scary what if. Another characteristic of anxiety is that it often has one right way to do things. It thinks that there's only one right way. Whereas intuition, on the other hand, is very open to lots of ideas. It knows that everything is going to be okay in the end, right? It's not attached to one specific path. Similarly, in our bodies, you can start to recognize the feeling of anxiety versus intuition. Intuition is an open kind of feeling. It's kind of hopeful, kind of calm, kind of curious, playful. Whereas anxiety is very tight. It might feel like knots in your stomach. It might feel like a weight on your chest or squeezing in your throat or your tensing of your shoulders. It's a very tight emotion. And interestingly enough, the more often you feel anxious and you drop into your body and you start to recognize the sensations of anxiety, it's going to become a lot easier for you to recognize when anxiety is speaking versus intuition. So even this week, I noticed that I was feeling kind of like a very specific type of anxiety where I had this thought, what if my husband doesn't love me? What if he would rather be with someone else? And I dropped into my body and I recognized this very specific sensation in my body that I hadn't felt since we were dating 2-3 years ago. And because I had become so familiar with that sensation, I was immediately able to say, oh, there's that anxiety again. There's that thought that my brain loves to go back to. And this is I know what this feels like, and I'm good at it. It's okay. I'm good at feeling anxiety. I'm good at understanding this sensation and not reading into it. This is what it is. And so, like I said, the more often you're able to jump into your body and recognize what the sensation of anxiety actually feels like, then when you are spinning later and you jump into your body and you realize it's the same sensation, then that's another hint or another clue where you can say, oh, I know what this is. This is what anxiety feels like. Okay, and the last one that I want to bring up is that anxiety is often chaotic and confusing and noisy. So there are often a lot of words in your brain when it's anxiety, versus intuition is slow and calm and open. Now, with all of this being said, I remember that when I was really struggling, I thought that the presence of anxiety meant that I was making the wrong choice. I thought, well, if I was just making the right choice, then I wouldn't feel anxiety. Anxiety is my body trying to tell me that I'm making the wrong choice, or it's God trying to tell me that I'm making the wrong choice. If I was making the right choice, I would feel calm. And I would pray and then hurry and check my body and check my feelings, and would often feel anxiety in my stomach. And what I want to say to you is that anxiety doesn't always mean something. It doesn't always mean that you're in the wrong relationship, or that God is trying to tell you to break up, or that you should be doing something else. It's really easy to think that because anxiety is a protector. It's trying to keep us safe. And of course, this advice does not apply to abusive relationships, right? But for those of us who are in healthy, non-abusive, good, like on paper, good relationships, anxiety doesn't have to have meaning. It can just be there. When we start to unattach meaning from anxiety, it stops having so much power. And honestly, for a while, I totally had to get rid of the idea of intuition and anxiety. I remember being like, okay, God, this isn't working. I don't know how to pray and without hyper fixating on my feelings and without being so anxious every time I pray and look for answers. And I was like, so God, I am going to set aside this idea of revelation and intuition, and I'm just going to do what I think is good. And that was so scary, but it was amazing how doing that lessened so much of the pressure. And I believe that God understands. I believe that He doesn't fault us for doing the best we can when we don't understand everything, when we don't know if it's anxiety or intuition. And to bring this all back to the question at the very beginning, is this anxiety or is this intuition? I want you to notice the energy behind that. That is very frantic. There's probably a big scary what if attached to it. And you might notice a tightening in your body when you ask that question. And so all of those are a cue that this is anxiety and that we don't need to engage with that question. As hard as it might be and as scary as it might be, we're going to say, you know what? I don't actually know. And I'm doing the very best I can to choose good things and to create beauty in my life. And it's okay. It's okay that I don't know if this is anxiety or intuition. And then move on. Which I know sounds so scary, but I kind of like to think about it as it's like anxiety breaks into your house and you recognize it, right? You're like, okay, I know that you're anxiety, and you tied up, right? Like maybe it's saying things like, what if you get divorced? Or what if you're not attracted to him, right? And you are easily able to identify those as anxiety, so you tie it up. And then anxiety starts to talk to you and it convinces you to untie it because it says things like, oh, but what if this is actually your intuition? Or what if you just want to get away with doing bad things? right? And anxiety convinces us to untie it and to let it loose again. And so, in the end, we really want to learn that language of anxiety so that no matter what it's saying to us, we're able to recognize it. We're able to recognize the sensations in our body and the words that it uses, the energy that it uses, and so that we don't engage with it. And as we do this, anxiety will have less and less power over us. It'll have less and less power over you. So, in the end, I just want to give you permission to not know if it's anxiety or intuition. That you can practice recognizing the language of anxiety and still not be sure, and that's okay. Because everything is going to be okay. Everything is going to work out, and you are going to be okay, no matter what. There are so many beautiful ways that you can create a life, a beautiful life. And that it's okay to let go of this idea of intuition. Like I said, I had to let go of that idea for years. And I feel like I'm just starting to relearn what intuition feels like, what revelation feels like, and starting to rebuild that knowledge and that understanding. So it's okay if it's taking a while and if this is a journey that you're on. You are doing a beautiful job. If you want help with all things anxiety and intuition related, all things relationship anxiety, please reach out. I will include a link to a free consult call in the description to this podcast. They're 45 minutes long with cameras off, and we really just chat and see where you are and see if coaching would help. And I love consult calls, so please feel free to reach out, and I will see you next time. Bye.